Hi, everybody. Welcome to Odd Week Sunday School. This is our lesson for January 31st, Sunday the 31st. So welcome if it's Sunday where you are or wherever you are. We're going to spend the next few weeks looking at the second gospel, the Gospel of Mark, the first chapter. And our lesson for today is about confronting evil. It's an episode where Jesus confronted something evil directly. You might even want to spend some part of this afternoon or this week reading the Gospel of Mark from start to finish. It's the shortest one, so I wouldn't dare ask you to read the longest one. And it's one of the advantages of sitting down and just sort of reading it briskly from beginning to end is that you really can appreciate better that way, I think, the voice of the one who was writing it, this person, Mark. And what is it that Mark wants to say to his readers about Jesus? You kind of soak it up better if you read it all in one go. So it's an interesting one. It's in this short version of the gospel, we don't get the Sermon on the Mount. We don't get the Sermon on the Plain. We don't get a genealogy. We don't get a well-worked-out theology of faith as we do in some of the other gospels. And the pace is very fast. The word that is translated variously, immediately, at once, then, all the same word in Greek, and always a word that means next. The passage for today that we're going to read in a few minutes is from the first chapter, verses 21 to 28. And in this passage, we see Jesus' first miracle, according to Mark. And what Jesus does in this miracle is to confront something evil, and he heals a person in the process. So according to Mark, this was the first miracle of Jesus. We talked last time, I think, about how John opened his gospel narrative with all that poetic theology. So today we're going to take a look at how Mark starts his. Mark opens his gospel, which he calls a gospel in the first sentence, with a sort of a misquotation from Isaiah, and then the story of John the Baptist. So Jesus appears right away in Mark's gospel as a grown-up, a young man, no birth narrative, no information about his parents or his family or childhood. He shows up, and John the Baptist baptizes Jesus. The Spirit of God descends on Jesus from the sky. A voice came out of heaven, the voice of God, saying to Jesus, "You are my son." Then the same Spirit sent Jesus out into the desert for 40 days, where he was tempted by Satan and attended by angels. And then Jesus went out into the countryside of Galilee, part of Judea, proclaiming the good news of God, which was that the kingdom of God is near. And then Jesus acquires 4 disciples right off the bat, 4 followers. There was Simon, who later gets named Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were fishermen. Then there was James and John, 2 other brothers, also fishermen. Okay, and now we're only in the middle of chapter 1, and all that has happened. The authorities tell us that Mark's gospel was the earliest one, the first one to be written. It's written probably in the later 60s or early 70s AD, so just a few decades really after Jesus. Luke and especially Matthew based their gospel stories, which are both longer, on this one. And then they elaborated on Mark's gospel, and they added a lot of other elements to it. And so it's kind of a miracle that we still have Mark's gospel, because often with ancient documents, when a newer version came along that was thought, as they were for a long time, Luke and Matthew, to be just better than the first one. They're more complete, they're more full, they're more careful. A lot of times the earlier version just gets discarded. But it's fortunate that that did not happen, because Mark sort of has a distinctive voice in his story of Jesus. And so it's good to have it there to read alongside the others. Who was this fellow Mark? Well, we have to just dig into other parts of the New Testament to answer that question, according to a couple of appearances in the book of Acts and a few of the New Testament letters, Paul and Peter. Mark was a person, a young man, younger than the disciples and younger than Jesus, also called John Mark, referred to sometimes as John, another John, who was, in that circle of the young followers of the way, as they said, the Jesus way. He was one of Paul's early assistants, a cousin of Barnabas, who was one of Paul's co-workers. And we find out in Paul that Mark, or John Mark, was with Paul during his imprisonment in Rome. He was probably the son of one of Jesus's female followers. He was a friend of Peter, a young friend of Peter. So this John Mark, or Mark, was in a good position to know from the disciples many stories about Jesus and about the others who worked to spread the gospel. If Mark ever met Jesus in person, we don't know if he did. He was probably a child at the time. We know that Peter had a special affection for Mark. In Peter's letter, he calls Mark my son, and he's not literally his son, but he's like a son to him. So it's often widely believed that in Mark's gospel, we get Peter's voice. There's a lot of Peter's preaching and Peter's telling of the story that appears in Mark. We don't know anything about Mark's education, but as a Jewish man writing a book in Greek, which he did, he had to be a person of some education. On the other hand, the experts tell us that Mark's Greek was not all that sophisticated, so you make of that what you will. Well, we don't know all that much about Mark's background, but we do know what he wrote. So maybe we should just tuck into that to understand what Mark thought about Jesus. So is Mark's gospel then just sort of a brief outline, a first crack at this story, something that's waiting for more skillful, careful, patient narrators to flesh out later on? Well, the scholar Luke Timothy Johnson, great name, Professor Luke Timothy Johnson, says no. Johnson says that Mark had a particular idea about Jesus, and that he took great pains to present this idea, this view of Jesus, to his readers. Johnson says that for Mark, and here's a quote from Professor Johnson, Jesus is the proclaimer of God's rule who conquers demons yet submits to human suffering. He conquers demons but submits to human suffering, this Jesus. He is the teacher whose words do not clarify but confound. That's the end of the quote. Everybody calls Jesus teacher in Mark's book, but often Jesus is acting rather than speaking. And when Jesus speaks in parables in Mark, these parables usually obscure more than they explain, and they turn more people away than they attract. In Mark's gospel, Jesus performs 18 miracles. 13 of those miracles are healing stories, so the bulk of them are healing. 4 of the healing stories are actually exorcisms or casting out of demons. All through his book, what Mark calls teaching would maybe better be understood as healing. That's what enormous crowds of people, and the crowd is like a character in Mark's gospel, the crowd follows Jesus around in search of healing, which they're apparently desperate for, and that was Jesus' reputation. So let's read this passage. It's from Mark chapter 1, verses 21 to 28. Did I say that? 21 to 28. Okay, here we go. After the calling of these 4 disciples, we'll pick the story up there. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent, and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching. and with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. At once, his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. Okay, let's picture this scene for a minute. Picture us all sitting in the sanctuary or Brown Hall. Maybe it's our first Sunday back together. Maybe we have a guest preacher. And right in the middle of this sermon by the guest preacher, while everyone else is being polite, one of our members cries out loudly, "What do you want with us? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are." Well, that would be memorable. And then who should do what with this outburst? Should somebody in the back row run out and call 911? Maybe the people sitting near this person should kind of stick him with their elbows and get him to be quiet. Maybe his wife should give him a look. Maybe the musicians will start to play. We can sing a hymn. Well, in Mark's story, what happens next turns this sort of whole situation in a different direction, because the guest preacher, Jesus in this case, looks at this man and shouts, "Be quiet," which seems rather direct, but not inappropriate. And then Jesus says, come out of him. Come out of him. I mean, who is Jesus talking to? According to Mark, Jesus is talking directly to this unclean spirit, this evil spirit or demon that possesses the man. And not only does Jesus address the unclean spirit, but the unclean spirit obeys his command. It doesn't say anything else except for a sort of a shriek when he comes out of the man, shaking the man violently. And we're not really surprised to read the next line. The people were all so amazed. Now, we could go off here in pursuit of trying to understand what is meant by an unclean spirit, or as some others put it, a demon. But if we do that, we're going to miss Mark's point, because Mark just assumed that his readers knew what he meant when he said unclean spirit. So let's just settle for this. Whatever it was, this spirit was something that had a grip on this man. It owned him. It wasn't a spirit of freedom, which is maybe why it was evil. Anyway, the man didn't really possess himself. He was not self-possessed. He was possessed by something foreign to himself that meant him harm. It didn't have his best interests at heart. Maybe this evil spirit made the man do obnoxious things or cruel things. At the very least, it made him blurt out a rude question in the middle of this guest preacher's sermon. So it's safe to assume that this man would be better off, much better off, if this thing left him. The evil spirit caused the man to suffer. And Jesus got all that. He didn't call 911. He didn't even speak to the man. He addressed the unclean spirit. And the unclean spirit, this is the most interesting part, knew who Jesus was. In Mark's gospel, this is a point that Professor Johnson makes, the first one to recognize who Jesus is God, when God proclaims, "You are my son," at his baptism. And the second one to say who Jesus was one of God's enemies, this unclean spirit. So I think and there are other places in the Gospel of Mark where it's the unclean spirits who know who Jesus is. I think it's fair to say that Jesus has, in this little story, confronted evil. He confronted it in a very practical way. The effect of evil was to cause human suffering. So what Jesus did was bring relief to the person who suffered. And there are lots of other places in the Gospel of Mark, as we said, where Jesus confronts human suffering by healing people. Later in chapter 1, he heals a man with leprosy. In chapter 2, he heals a paralyzed person. In chapter 5, there are 3 healing stories. One of them is another exorcism, where Jesus sent the evil spirit into a herd of pigs. That's a good one. By chapter 6, there's huge crowds of people following around Jesus. They suffer from all kinds of maladies, and Jesus can cure some of them just by letting them touch the hem of his cloak. And then in chapter 8, he heals a blind man. So what's the point of this particular episode in the synagogue in Capernaum in Mark's introductory chapter, the casting out of a demon? Well, it was Mark's choice to record this showdown with an unclean spirit in the synagogue as Jesus' first miraculous healing. You might remember that in John's gospel, there's a different first miracle. In John's gospel, the first miracle is turning water into wine at a wedding. In Matthew's gospel, this story that Mark tells isn't really even mentioned. So Mark has made a clear literary decision to make this be the first thing, the first miracle that he accounts. Furthermore, Mark emphasizes that the impact of this scene on the people who witnessed it in the synagogue was to impress them with Jesus' authority. Jesus has authority over this evil spirit. And at other points in Mark's gospel, it's the evil spirits who know who he is. And this is what Professor Johnson thinks is special about Mark's gospel and the way that Mark portrays Jesus. Many, many people in Mark's gospel, in fact, most people, do not understand who he is. The scribes and Pharisees do not understand who Jesus is. The Roman authorities do not understand who Jesus is. And most of the time, even the disciples are not very clear about who Jesus is. Finally, in chapter 8, halfway through the book, Peter says to Jesus, "You are the Christ, the Messiah." But then even Peter sort of falls back into not getting it before this story ends. The one other person in the story who knows right at the beginning who Jesus is when he first meets him is his executioner in chapter 15. So Mark's making a very strong claim in his introductory chapter that Jesus has authority over all, over evil, because Jesus is the Son of God, the promised one of Israel. And that's a point that Mark makes again and again. It's a cosmic claim. And the other thing this little story shows us is how Jesus understood and confronted evil. Evil was something that made people suffer. And Jesus was not willing to let this man continue to suffer. So Jesus confronted the evil thing right then and there, the first time that he noticed it. And the effects of confronting it was to heal this person. So when the folks in the synagogue concluded that they had witnessed a new teaching, and with authority, what was the teaching exactly? There hadn't been very many words involved in the teaching. It seems to me that in this case, the teaching was really healing. The teaching wasn't words, it was an action. In Mark's gospel, Jesus has cosmic authority from the beginning of his ministry, and that could only come from God, the God who had announced to him, "You are my Son, with whom I'm well pleased, whom I love." What Jesus chose to do with this authority was to confront evil where he found it. In other words, to confront the things that possess people and harm them. He confronted evil in a very practical way, because above all, he noticed suffering, and he had compassion for those who suffered. So maybe you want to read this book in the next few days. I recommend it. And I'll see you again next week, because we have 2 odd weeks in a row. So I'll see you on February 7th. And until then, stay well.